This is obviously a experience of long distance learning, but I want you to take it personally because I do. I have been so moved by what I have found underneath the words agrapha, those unseen things, that the story beneath the story that I never really heard about before. And that's what I'm trying to impart to you, is so you can share some of that. It's actually excitement when I discover these things. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's ever discovered them, but I was never taught them in seminary or in Sunday school. I have on your visual the outline for today, just the generality. It's finding certainty with Mark 6 through 8. And I want to begin again with a prayer, and I call it an Abba prayer simply because Jesus used the word Abba. And he taught his disciples to use the word Abba. And he didn't just teach them to use the word on the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father, but always when they prayed. So I'd like to begin that way. And then we're going to take a quick look at Jesus' family, which I didn't know existed. Nobody told me. But now Mark has. And the words that were said to the little girl, the daughter of the synagogue leader who died. And Jesus raised her from the dead, according to Mark. But the words themselves are interesting. And then what's been going on and what's going to go on for a few more chapters is, well, till the end of the book, is choosing sides. Conflict and rejection over and over and over again. And then there's an interesting thing in Mark. He reports in some early chapters, like 5 and 6, a set of 3 or 4 things that happened with Jesus. And then he repeats them again in 8, with a slight nuance here and there. Well, I've called it deja vu all over again. Thank you, Yogi Bear. But I wonder why. I think there's a secret there that we need to notice. And then I hope we get to the women in his life, because they were important. They were with him seemingly all the time that his disciples were with him. And I don't want to Da Vinci Code you, but the importance of Mary Magdalene cannot be overlooked or reinterpreted or interpreted wrongly. So, let's begin with the prayer, the Abba prayer. That's what's called the ipsissima vox, the actual word. Scholars believe that's one of those distinguishing marks that Jesus had. Maybe all of them, maybe the New Testament reports many, but as they think back, it is so unusual. It's so unusual in the Middle Eastern vocabulary. It's so unusual to the Jews. It's unusual by all accounts, and that's one of the reasons why they keep coming back to the word Abba, scholars. And also because it's backed up in 3 of the Gospels, or 2 of them in Paul. You may know that his disciples said, well, teach us to pray that way. They knew of the intimacy that Jesus experienced with his Father in heaven. And so in Matthew 6, 5 through 15, and Luke 11, 1 through 13, those two gospel writers have collected words about prayer. This often happens. It wasn't that Jesus spoke everything in those chapters about prayer, but Mark collected them so that you would have a subtopic on prayer. Now, I want to show you what we think the original Lord's Prayer, not the one in Luke, not the one in Matthew, because they vary slightly. But it looked like this, if you look at the left-hand side of the page. Abba, my or our Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, and that's an iffy in parentheses, whether that was in the original or not. Give us our daily bread. Some think that really Jesus was talking about the so-called bread of tomorrow. When we eat that feast, that heavenly feast with God in the kingdom of heaven. And forgive us our sins as we are called to forgive those who sin against us. And then a purely apocalyptic ending here, save us from the time of trial. And if you want to know what the trial is, well, go to the book of Revelation. But this was more than just a single book. It was a kind of language that most of the Jews in that area were caught up in. It may have come from Persia. We don't know for sure, but it overlaid some of the things that Jesus did. Finally, I want to quote Paul about this Abba prayer thing. In Romans 8:15, Paul says, when we cry, Abba, Father, it is the Spirit himself or herself bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. Isn't that something? That's really strong. So I'd like to pray the prayer that I put together on the right-hand side of the page using our Father. And you can pray it with me. I can hear you, I think. Father, help us to remember all the ways you are with us. Your sunlight greeted us this morning. We caught the scent of autumn in the cool, crisp air and the beautiful trees covered in snow. All signs of your presence that sing to us. Help us to sense your loving presence no matter what this day brings. For the promise of renewed life, every day we give you thanks. In our hearts, we greet and end this day with joy and thanksgiving. Amen. I want you to think back before you read Mark 6 through 8, which I hope you did. Did you know that Jesus had a family? I don't mean just Mary and Joseph, who seems to have been out of the picture by the time that Mark, the earliest gospel, reported, because he's never mentioned after the first scenes in Luke and Matthew and so forth. But it was a large family. Mark's statement is this: they're talking to each other because Jesus has come back and he seems to be beside himself, out of his mind. A different person is what they said. And they said to each other, this is Jesus' family. I'm sorry. This is what the Pharisees and the onlookers in Nazareth said. Is not this the carpenter? Notice they call Jesus the carpenter. The son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. And are not his sisters here with us? Oh my, that is a big family. 8, 7, 6, whatever. But it just means we have to re-understand what this is all about. And when we think of family, I'm not talking about a split-level house in suburbia. We're looking at peasant people living in a peasant village and working perhaps in a Roman city nearby. And I know this isn't Jewish people necessarily because they look very Middle Eastern on your screen. They are maybe Palestinians or Syrians or Iraqis, but they're all kind of, they give a feeling for what a family like Jesus' own family might have been like. One of the reasons we haven't been apprised of Jesus' family is that over the centuries, mainline churches such as the Roman Catholic accorded Mary, the mother of Jesus, accolade after accolade, eventually elevating her to Queen of Heaven and a lot of other things that churches are named by. Queen of Heaven and an Immaculate Virgin. In other words, she couldn't have had other boys and girls. She couldn't have had other children because Jesus was one of a kind, wasn't he? But that's not Mark's report. Jesus had siblings. They were not cousins, but by calling them cousins, the Roman Catholic Church has tried to preserve her virginity and contradict the plain statement in Mark. And since so many of us have worshiped, Protestants alike, the post-Easter Jesus, the Jesus Christ, the Son of God, naturally we wouldn't expect Son of God divinity to be born of a virgin to have other brothers and sisters. I mean, we bought into it tacitly, if for no other reason. In other words, we've been collaborators with the Roman Catholic Church in this assumption. And I dare say there may be lingering in your mind the thought, no, we didn't have brothers and sisters. Yeah, but he did. He really did. Because he was really a man, a person, a brother to his family. Another topic, and I'm not just going straight through verse by verse today. I'm seizing on those things that interest me. Mark tells us memorable stories about healings and demonology, the exorcism of demons. By the way, I just want to say, since we talked about this the last time, I think anything that was wrong with the person, I've come to the conclusion, almost anything, in any category, psychological or otherwise, the people in that area and in that day just referred to them as demons. They didn't have to be specific about the kind of demons, but the generality, demons, kind of covered it all. I kind of arrived at that this week after weighing again this whole subject of demons. But Mark tells this beautiful story. I mean, in the Gospels, there are certain just gem-like stories that are remembered and remembered and remembered in the traditions that followed Jesus. And I think this would be one of them. If you've ever had a child that's been deathly sick, and many of us have, most of us have, or if you've ever been around a family where a child is dying, or relate yourself here to these words. And Jesus comes to the home of the synagogue leader, and people are wailing and crying, and they say she's already dead, and I don't think Jesus really just wrote it off with, no, she's only sleeping. I think that's maybe Mark's or some other insert from somewhere. But Jesus went in, and he said to the little girl, Talitha cum, which means in Aramaic, little girl, arise. Now, maybe those words won't serve you particularly, but maybe they will. I think that's the reason Mark reports it. I think he says it in the language Jesus said, so you and I could pick up on it and be part of it, and our lives could be part of it. No, it isn't going to necessarily raise a child from the dead for you, but it will let you know that those are Jesus' intentions. Talitha cum. I think that's beautiful. Thirdly, you should know also, Aramaic was the spoken language of Jesus. It is a version of Hebrew that is a popular version of the words of the masses, the way they talked to each other. And then there's Hebrew, and then there's Greek. And Greek was the worldwide language, and that's why the Gospels were written in Greek. We have to assume that either the original writers and Paul knew Greek very well, and they probably did, or as it was handed on in written form, perhaps later editors did exactly that, rendered it into Greek, because that's what everybody was reading in the world, the civilized world of that day. Okay, fourth, choosing sides. Jesus is always choosing, he's always having to make a decision about whose side is he on. And first of all, right on the board itself are, and the visual, are many of the places. This is Jesus' travel before he went finally to Jerusalem, near the end of his life, for his execution. And I'm not saying anybody has to know this or memorize it, but just look at on the right-hand side at the various cities, villages. So he seemed to really have a point. He seemed to want to spread this dream of God, spread this kingdom of God idea and fact for life. Today we keep hearing over and over again how divided our country is after the election. And it's still there, and it's not getting much better as far as I can see, but maybe later in the spring it will change a little bit. When I was young, now I may have told this story to some Pathways people before, but when I was young, I had a nanny, a maid, a black woman that we brought from North Carolina when we moved to the D.C. area, Bethesda, Maryland. She lived with us. Her name was Mariah. That's a biblical place in the Bible. That's a place in the Bible, Mariah. Now, they don't just call the winds Mariah, It's a place. Anyway, she would take me by the hand when I was quite young, and we would walk up to East-West Highway, a main drag in Bethesda, and sit on some tree stumps, some tree roots, and the sidewalk across from a Catholic church named Our Lady of Lourdes. And on their grounds, maybe they had a festival, I'm not sure, there was a merry-go-round. And there were kids going merry-go-round. But I was never allowed to cross the street with Mariah. I was never, primarily because I wasn't allowed to set foot on ride that merry-go-round. I didn't know I had to choose sides, but there it was, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Lutheran, right there in my origins. And some years later, we were visiting my grandmother and other relatives in North Carolina. And we went to Charlotte, because that's where our little town was near, my birthplace. We went to Charlotte, and one of the big department stores, I think it was Belk's. They didn't have malls, but they had a few big department stores. And as my mother and her friends or her relatives were looking for material, which I'm really allergic to, psychologically, looking at material. It feels like I always did that when I went out with my mother, but it isn't true. But anyway, I asked if I could go over and drink from the fountain, and I did. And when I came back, I was told, in no uncertain terms, that I drank from the fountain labeled colored rather than white. Back then, I didn't know I had to choose sides. Black, white. But it was so obvious in the signage, not only for water fountains, but in stores where black people were not welcome. About the same time at home, my friends and I, and when I was a little older, used to go to cowboy movies at the Heiser Theater on Wisconsin Avenue. We loved Saturday matinees. And so when we were home, sometimes we would play with our little toys, cowboys and Indians. That's what we had. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy. Of course. Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, you name it. We wanted to be with the heroes who slaughtered the Indians. Back then, I didn't know I was choosing sides, which obviously prejudices your later adult life, whether you like it or not, whether you change your mind about Native Americans or not. There's always that little inkling of prejudice because we played with toys, cowboys and Indians. Jesus had to choose sides because the Pharisees and the Sadducees and maybe the Zealots and maybe some Essene type, they were all arguing with him because they didn't like the way he did some things. He was supposed to fast like a good Jew at certain times, and he didn't always do that with his disciples. If they were hungry, they were going to eat. The same thing went with impurity. Pharisees were really big on impurity rules. They wanted to make sure the populace did those things so that their hands were clean. You know about hands clean. Jesus could have caved in and said, oops, you're right. We need to go wash our hands again, or for the first time. Or he could have said, oops, you're right. We should have fasted. Or he could have said, oops, I shouldn't have touched that sick person. He could have sided with those leaders. Didn't he know it would be wise to do that? I mean, if you're in a conversation and all of those people around you, maybe you're visiting a family, are Democrats, or they're all Republicans, I don't think you're going to stir up the hornet's nest, are you? You're going to just politely keep the cover on if you don't agree with them. Jesus always seemed to choose the side of truth, as he knew it. Truth. And the underlying truth, as he knew it. And also, he chose to side with sinners, with poor people, with the unclean. He even had dinner. You know, guess who's coming to dinner? Well, all those people, the riffraff. That's who he chose over the pious and well-dressed Pharisees or Sadducees or synagogue leaders or you name it. Now, I don't think we can realize how dangerous, how radical that would have been. How very radical, and one begins to sense that he's not going to get away with it. That there's going to be trouble ahead, down the road, at Jerusalem, because of these choices that he's made. And if he needed an example, he could look at John the Baptist, whose head came rolling off because of the same reasons. He was setting a new path. He was challenging the status quo. The problem for us isn't just the past. It's the present too. Do we have the courage and the determination in our presence, the wisdom to be one of Jesus' followers, and no matter what, stand for the truth. Stand for others who are poor. I don't know. I don't know about you. I don't know about me. But I know that smacks us straight in the face. It should. It jumps out of Mark's gospel. Another story that deserves some kind of attention is the fact that Mark tells a similar series of stories back in 5 and 6, maybe 4, 5, and 6, and then in 8. Kind of look at that and you'll see what I mean. Jesus stills the sea. And then in 6, he walks on the sea. But that's a way of stilling it, right? He goes to the boat. Oh, ye of little faith, sort of thing. And then Jesus feeds 5,000. But over in later chapters, he does the same thing all over again with only 4,000. And he has over in the early chapters, he has this ongoing controversy with the Pharisees, And over in the other one, right after the feeding of the thousands, there is this controversy with Pharisees. Oh, I forgot. He crossed the sea right after the feeding of the 5,000, and again after the feeding of the 4,000. By the sea, I mean Galilee. And then finally, in this little series, he heals a deaf man, 7:31. And then he heals a blind man over chapters later, 8. What the heck's going on here? Did he just do the same thing twice? I think that what Mark is doing is he has two separate sources that come through two villages or communities, I would say. In other words, the story was the same one told originally, but as it gets transmitted, it changes a little bit as people remember it. And so Mark, here he is with two traditions. He's trying to put everything together and make one for you and for his readers. And he decides he just doesn't have the right to cancel out one or the other, even though it's pretty obvious. I think Mark decided it would be better to just include both because they may have happened. And Mark wants to be faithful to what Jesus did and said. So even though it is repetitious, he goes ahead and includes them. Now let's dwell for a minute on the feeding of the thousands. That's known as a nature miracle in Mark, if you want to call it a miracle, and I don't. But we have seen something similar. At Woodstock, what was that? 1969. 150,000 people were expected at this rock concert. A lot of Janis Joplin, big names were there, really big names. Anyway, 400 to 500,000 came. Can you imagine? In that cornfield, in that field, that farm field? Just driving there, I've seen photographs of the traffic. How they ever did. And here's the concert. From the concert stage. That's I'll think of it in a minute. But look out at that crowd. Have you ever seen anything like that? I don't think the Beatles ever drew a crowd that big. I think that's a wow. And the concerts went on. Here's another view, looking toward the stage, no less. And these people all stayed. And a lot of them didn't want to give up their choice seats near the stage. So, and people had been dancing, splashing in mud, tripping on LSD for two or 3 days. And Sunday morning, if you haven't eaten in over 24 hours, because you didn't want to surrender your spot near the stage, you turn around and find someone passing to you, not a joint, not ambrosia, but a Dixie cup full of granola. Nobody knew what granola was in 1969. Listening to people tell of their experiences at Woodstock. Let me quote you. The food ran out fast and everyone shared what they had brought with them. There was a sharing mentality, and people who had come prepared were generous with what they had, a festival goer from Boston told me. When word of the food shortage, and it would, got out, there were a couple of men who took it upon themselves to try to, in some way, solve the issue. They rallied nearby villages who supplied water and sandwiches and canned foods. And they even got an army helicopter to parachute food on the site. And according to the Huffington Post, an article called The Untold Story of the Food Shortage at Woodstock, there's this quote: "One common thread is that everyone remembers very little about the food except for two things." I'm quoting: "The food ran out fast and everyone shared what they had." Is that what happened on the hillside near Galilee? I'm not trying to water down what we've always considered a miracle of Jesus, so many loaves and so many fishes. But there was a little miracle there in feeding 400 to 500,000 people. That's 500,000. And I think we could see the story beneath the story. I know you've maybe heard that people shared things, but we have a real life story that may help us to explain the situation. And then finally, the importance of women in Jesus' life and ministry at his death and resurrection. We cannot overemphasize that. We're looking at this information from a 20th century site, and we still have prejudice against. We're still struggling to let women emerge, and they are some of the most compelling and intelligent women during this last election and dealing with this COVID pandemic have been women. Have you noticed that? Amy Adams in Bexley, the health person. I'm over and over impressed with the role women are now taking on, women who are doing the job. Maybe they're our salvation, but I don't know. Compared with Jewish scriptures and the culture of the Middle East, it was so radical and groundbreaking, it's taken us, as I wrote in your pondering too, 2,000 years to catch up to Jesus. He treats all people equally, the sick and the healthy, the respected and the poor. He empowers them, the women and others, with their own authority as authentic persons. And here is something that's worth looking at. These are all quotes from the Gospels. Many women also, there looking on from a distance, they had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Names them. Matthew. And from Mark, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bought spices so they might go and anoint the body. And then from Luke, after meeting an angel at Jesus' tomb, Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and other women with them who told this to the disciples. And then that absolutely stunning story in John. Early on the first day of the week. That means on Sunday. That's the first day of the week in Jewish terms. After his crucifixion, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been rolled away. Jesus said to her, Mary. She thought he was the gardener until he said, Mary. She turned around and said to him, Teacher. And here again, the actual word, Rabboni. Jesus said to her, and this is so interesting, do not touch me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. Do not touch me? Oh, well, was Mary Magdalene used to touching him? I don't know. John was written a heck of a lot later, and maybe it's just poetic exaggeration, but those words make me wonder what her relationship was with Jesus. Obviously, there were women there. Obviously, Mary Magdalene, because she is named over and over again in all the Gospels. Mary of Magdala, that's on your map, Magdala. It's on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. But there's this tantalizing mystery, and I know the Da Vinci Code, they got so many facts wrong, biblically and historically, but that's all dedicated to Mary Magdalene marrying Jesus and having children, which are with us to this day. I don't believe that, but that's what Dan Brown was hunting, and Tom Hanks played along with it in the movie, as you know. And the church has often insinuated that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. How many times have you heard that? I mean, was she? It doesn't ever say she was a prostitute. But it's convenient to make her a prostitute to contrast her with the Virgin Mary. And besides that, we would have trouble believing Jesus, the Son of God, would be falling in love with a prostitute. He may talk to her, but not falling in love. But the truth of the matter is, and many progressive biblical scholars have come to this conclusion, Mary Magdalene was really first among the disciples. Not Peter. She wasn't called a disciple because she was a woman. But she is mentioned so prominently. Who did Jesus appear to in his resurrection garb? Mary Magdalene. Why didn't he just appear to Peter and James and John and the rest? You can't write that off. You may have noticed the Bible speaks of two kinds of love. There is agape love, using the Greek, which is a godly love, a spiritual kind of love, which we assume Jesus had for folks. And then there's eros, like erotic. Then there's eros, human love, the love between two humans. Okay, what was it? Was it eros love? Or was it agape love? I mean, you could make a case for either one. I'm talking about between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. I am voting for both. I think their relationship was both very human, whatever that means, and at the same time spiritual, whatever that means. I can give you other examples, but maybe you can play with that. Maybe you can chew on that and see where you come out. See what effect it may have on your opinion of Jesus down the road. I hope your week goes well. Don't slip on the snow. It's been a privilege. Goodbye.